And I think based on that, I won't even take questions today because there's no way I can take questions that are anywhere comparable to what you just witnessed. You just witnessed drug prices that will go down at levels never thought even possible, Marty, right? Never thought even possible. And I think that the second biggest part of this meeting is going to be the fact that I'm going to call in the insurance companies that are making so much money and they have to make less, a lot less. And maybe we can have reasonable health care without having to cut them out and let it all go awry. So we're going to be calling a meeting. It'll be either in Florida or it'll be here the first week. And I'd prefer not talking and asking questions only for the reason that this is such a big announcement, meaning what these people have said and what the other four companies are going to say, which is exactly.
You watch this spectacle unfold, and the sheer audacity of it hits you like a freight train because here we have a man standing before the nation, flanked by pharmaceutical executives in expensive suits bragging about drug prices, while simultaneously announcing he won't take questions from the press. And the timing of this performance couldn't be more revealing, because at this very moment, the Justice Department faces a December 19 deadline to release files related to Jeffrey Epstein, and suddenly accountability becomes something to be dodged and deflected rather than embraced. This is the architecture of authoritarian impulse dressed up in the language of populist triumph. This is how power protects itself when the walls start closing in, and you need to understand what you're watching because this isn't just about drug prices or healthcare reform, or even Epstein. This is about a fundamental corruption of democratic accountability that operates through spectacle and deflection and the weaponization of access itself. After returning to office and acquiring the unilateral authority to publish the files, Trump dismissed the years-long push for transparency that he had once encouraged as a Democrat hoax and fought Congress over its drive to get the records out in public, but relented and signed the Epstein Files Act once a sweeping bipartisan consensus made opposition untenable, and now here he stands refusing to answer questions at precisely the moment when questions matter most, because the Epstein Files Transparency Act forces the Justice Department to confront years of secrecy surrounding the late financier's alleged sex trafficking operation, a case that has become shorthand for accusations of elite protection and systemic failure. The symbolism here is so thick you could cut it with a knife, because what we're witnessing is the performance of power that understands its own vulnerability, that recognizes the threat posed by genuine scrutiny, and responds not with transparency, but with theatrical gestures designed to dominate the news cycle and control the narrative before the narrative can control him. Now let's talk about what's actually happening in this moment, because Trump announced new deals with 9 pharmaceutical companies to lower drug prices flanked by the company's leaders. And the framing here is crucial, because he's positioning himself as the champion of ordinary Americans battling greedy insurance companies, when in reality he's literally surrounded by the very executives whose corporations have spent decades maximizing profits at the expense of human life, dignity. The cognitive dissonance is staggering, and it reveals something profound about how contemporary right-wing politics operates through this constant tension between populist rhetoric and oligarchic reality, between the language of opposition to elite power and the practice of consolidating that very power in fewer and fewer hands. This is not healthcare reform in any meaningful progressive sense. This is corporate deal-making rebranded as salvation. This is the negotiated settlement of the ruling class presented as revolutionary change, and the fact that he refuses to take questions immediately after this announcement tells you everything you need to know about whether this administration actually wants scrutiny of these arrangements, or simply wants to harvest the political capital from appearing to do something. But here's where it gets truly explosive, because when asked aboard Air Force One whether there was something incriminating about him in the Jeffrey Epstein files, Trump told Bloomberg News' Catherine Lucy, "Quiet piggy," and this wasn't just rudeness or typical Trump vulgarity. This was a calculated act of intimidation aimed at journalists attempting to fulfill their democratic function of holding power accountable. Trump has spent the first 2 weeks of his second term restricting the public's access to government information, taking government web pages offline, deleting vital data that was previously available to the public, and restricted journalists' access to the White House and Pentagon. And when you connect these dots, you see a comprehensive strategy of opacity designed to shield the powerful from the consequences of their actions. The pattern is unmistakable, and it fits within a longer historical trajectory of authoritarianism that understands journalism as a threat to be neutralized, rather than an institution to be protected, that sees transparency as weakness rather than democratic necessity, that recognizes that once you control information flows, You control the possibilities for resistance and accountability themselves. The Epstein case has become in the American consciousness something larger than the specific crimes of one predatory financier, because Trump and his allies have repeatedly claimed that prominent Democrats and Hollywood figures were protected from accountability, framing the Epstein scandal as proof that money and influence can subvert the justice system. But the president himself once counted Epstein among his social companions, as the two circulated in the same Palm Beach and New York milieus in the 1990s, and appeared together at parties for years before Trump later said their relationship powered. This is projection at its most brazen and most revealing, because the very people screaming loudest about elite pedophile networks and two-tiered justice systems are themselves members of that elite, enjoying protections that ordinary Americans could never access. And when we talk about a two-tiered justice system, we need to be absolutely clear about what that means, because Trump's accountant Alan Weisselberg served 99 days in Rikers for tax fraud, while thousands of black men within the same walls remain there for longer, just awaiting trial. And in fact, 9 out of 10 detainees at Rikers Island, which is made up of 90.1% people of color, have not yet been convicted of a crime. The real two-tiered system isn't about Trump versus Biden, or Republicans versus Democrats. It's about wealth versus poverty. It's about whiteness versus blackness. It's about those who can hire lawyers to delay and appeal and negotiate versus those who languish in pretrial detention because they can't make bail. And here's what makes this moment so infuriating and so clarifying, because lawyers for some of Epstein's victims allege there are at least 20 names of men who are accused of sex crimes in the possession of the FBI, and the information will show in certain cases how powerful men said that they had control over the local police in New York, or had contacts with the FBI, told survivors not to report things because they would not go anywhere, and it needs to come out who the other powerful men were on Epstein's rape island. This is the architecture of elite impunity laid bare. This is how power protects itself through networks and connections, and the strategic deployment of institutional authority to silence victims and shield perpetrators. And when Trump stands there refusing questions while surrounded by pharmaceutical executives, at the precise moment when these revelations are supposed to emerge, you have to ask yourself whether this is coincidence or strategy, whether this is incompetence or calculation, whether what we're watching is simply a man's general aversion to accountability or something more specific and more sinister. Let's connect this to the larger pattern of press intimidation, because the attacks against the press carried out by Trump since the start of his second term have increasingly stretched beyond rhetoric and policy and turned into physical limitations for journalists. And there are 8 ways the U.S. administration is physically restricting journalists' access to areas where they were previously free to report. This isn't just about one press conference or one refusal to answer questions. This is a systematic assault on the institutional mechanisms through which democratic accountability operates. This is the construction of an information architecture where power speaks without being questioned, where announcements replace dialogues, where the citizen becomes passive recipient rather than active participant in democratic deliberation. When he says, "I won't even take questions today because there's no way I can take questions that are anywhere comparable to what you just witnessed," he's not making an argument about the importance of the drug price announcement. He's asserting a principle about his relationship to scrutiny itself. He's claiming the right to determine when and whether he will submit to questioning. He's treating democratic accountability as optional rather than obligatory. The healthcare theater here is particularly galling because Trump said health insurance companies have gotten rich on billions of dollars of money that should go directly to the people, claiming that the Unaffordable Care Act, an Obama-era law, was created to make these companies rich, and his remarks come as millions of Americans who get health insurance through the ACA prepare to pay twice as much on average in premiums next year, after Congress could not agree on how or whether to extend subsidies set to expire at the end of the month. So we have a performance of concern for ordinary Americans struggling with healthcare costs, delivered by an administration whose party in Congress just allowed subsidies to expire that will cause those costs to skyrocket. We have populist rhetoric about insurance company greed, alongside policy that actually increases the burden on working families. We have the spectacle of reform without the substance of structural change. This is neoliberal governance wearing a populist mask. This is the performance of opposition to corporate power by a government completely captured by corporate interests, and the fact that pharmaceutical executives stand beside him nodding along tells you exactly who benefits from this arrangement. But let's return to the Epstein question, because this is where the rubber really meets the road. In terms of elite accountability, and Attorney General Pam Bondi last week ordered a top federal prosecutor to lead an investigation into people who knew Epstein and some of Trump's political foes, including Clinton, and that investigation taken up at Trump's urging, despite the Justice Department previously finding no evidence to support such a probe, could give the government grounds to withhold documents. This is accountability theater at its most cynical, because rather than allowing a transparent release of documents that might implicate powerful people across the political spectrum, we get a politically motivated investigation aimed at Trump's enemies that can then be used as justification for withholding information in the name of not compromising an ongoing probe. The game is rigged from the start and everyone knows it, and the strategic brilliance of it from a purely Machiavellian perspective is that it allows the administration to claim they're pursuing accountability while actually ensuring that the full scope of elite criminality remains hidden behind classification and redactions and investigative privilege. Frustration is mounting inside the Justice Department as it races to redact thousands of pages of files related to Jeffrey Epstein before they must be released Friday, multiple sources familiar with the process told CNN. And you have to understand what this means in practice, because each redaction is a choice about what the public gets to know about how power operates. Each blackened passage is a decision about whether transparency or protection of the powerful takes precedence. Each withheld document becomes another brick in the wall that separates citizens from the truth about how elite networks function. Democrats said Trump and the Department of Justice are now violating federal law as they continue covering up the facts and evidence about Jeffrey Epstein's decades-long billion-dollar international sex trafficking ring, and for months Pam Bondi has denied survivors the transparency and accountability they have demanded and deserve, and has defied the Oversight Committee's subpoena while the Department of Justice is now making clear it intends to defy Congress itself even as it gives star treatment to Epstein's convicted co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell. This is not partisan hyperbole. This is documentation of systematic obstruction of congressional oversight and legal mandates. This is the executive branch asserting supremacy over the legislative branch in ways that fundamentally undermine the constitutional architecture of checks and balances. The drug pricing announcement becomes in this context not the main event but the distraction, not the substance but the spectacle designed to dominate headlines and social media feeds, while the real story, the story about elite criminality and institutional protection of predators, and the systematic cover-up of evidence documenting decades of abuse, remains buried under layers of classification and redaction and bureaucratic obstruction. This is how power operates in late capitalism, not through crude censorship, but through the strategic deployment of spectacle and the manipulation of information flows and the creation of multiple competing narratives that fragment attention and make coherent resistance more difficult. When Trump says he won't take questions, he's not just being defensive about a specific issue, he's asserting a broader principle about his immunity from scrutiny, his right to control the terms of engagement with democratic institutions, his authority to determine what information reaches the public, and when and how. Let me be absolutely clear about what's at stake here, because FBI Director Kash Patel had accused the government of hiding a damaging list of sexual predators affiliated with Epstein prior to joining the administration. But those claims have not panned out, and the issue has been one of the most divisive within the Republican Party, as Trump, who was formerly among Epstein's many wealthy friends, also downplayed the file's significance, upsetting a faction of his supporters, and the president for months resisted signing the transparency bill, which had bipartisan support, but he relented as its passage became inevitable. The transparency rhetoric was always a weapon to be used against political enemies, never a principle to be applied universally, and now that Trump controls the machinery of disclosure, he suddenly discovers all sorts of reasons why transparency might be dangerous or premature or complicated by ongoing investigations. This is textbook authoritarian opportunism. This is the cynical manipulation of legitimate demands for accountability in service of partisan advantage, and it reveals something crucial about how contemporary right-wing populism operates through the performance of opposition to elite corruption, while actually deepening and entrenching that very corruption. The pharmaceutical executives standing behind Trump as he makes this announcement are not props. They are co-conspirators in a system that treats healthcare as a profit center, rather than a human right, that prices insulin at levels that force diabetics to ration life-saving medication, that patents drugs developed with public funding and then charges Americans multiples of what citizens in other countries pay for the exact same medications. 9 more pharmaceutical companies committed to Trump's most favored nation drug pricing policy and agreed to lower U.S. prices for some of their products, including Merck GlaxoSmithKline, Sanofi Genentech, Bristol Myers Squibb, Amgen, Novartis Gilead, and Boehringer Ingelheim. And while any reduction in drug prices is nominally positive, we need to ask ourselves what these companies are getting in exchange. What regulations are being rolled back? What patent protections are being extended? What tax breaks are being negotiated behind closed doors? while the cameras focus on the performative announcement of price cuts that may or may not materialize in ways that actually help ordinary people. This is the neoliberal playbook perfected: the substitution of voluntary corporate commitments for mandatory regulation, the replacement of systemic reform with ad hoc deal-making, the prioritization of relationships between executives and politicians over the democratic input of citizens. And when Trump refuses to take questions about these deals, he's not protecting some noble cause. He's protecting the opacity that allows these arrangements to be structured in ways that benefit corporations first and consumers as an afterthought. He's ensuring that journalists can't ask about the details and the enforcement mechanisms and the loopholes that will inevitably emerge once the publicity has faded and the cameras have moved on to the next manufactured crisis. The Epstein connection brings all of this into sharp relief, because what the Epstein case represents at its core is the way elite networks protect their own, the way money and power and connections can insulate predators from consequences, the way institutions that are supposed to protect the vulnerable instead protect the powerful. Epstein amassed powerful allies, maintained luxury properties where abuse allegedly occurred, and secured a hugely contentious 2008 plea deal in a separate case that critics say may have protected unnamed co-conspirators, and his subsequent arrest, followed by his death in a New York jail, officially ruled a suicide, reignited questions over how such conduct persisted for years with limited accountability. That 2008 plea deal was negotiated by Alexander Acosta, who later served as Trump's labor secretary, before resigning when the Epstein connections became too politically toxic, and the fact that this administration is now in charge of determining what documents get released about Epstein's network should alarm anyone who cares about accountability, because the people making decisions about disclosure are implicated in the systems of protection that allowed the abuse to continue. This is why Trump's refusal to take questions in this moment is so revealing and so important, because journalists who are allowed to ask follow-ups would ask about his own connections to Epstein, would ask about why he dismissed the transparency push as a hoax after promising to release everything, would ask about the strategic timing of launching investigations that can be used to justify withholding documents, would ask about what specific commitments these pharmaceutical companies have made and how they will be enforced, and what happens if they don't follow through. These are the questions that democracy requires and that authoritarianism refuses. These are the mechanisms through which citizens exercise sovereignty over their government, and Trump is explicitly rejecting that sovereignty, is asserting instead a model where he announces and we applaud, where he performs and we consume, where he controls the narrative and we accept whatever version of reality he chooses to present. Trump barred the Associated Press from White House pool events for refusing to use the Gulf of America and the FCC's investigation into outlets like NBC, ABC, CBS, well as NPR show that all of these actions kind of taken individually might seem like a one-off case, but when put together, paint a really alarming picture of deteriorating media freedom in the U.S. This is the comprehensive strategy I'm talking about. This is the systematic construction of an information environment where dissent is punished and compliance is rewarded, where journalists who ask tough questions get excluded from access, and those who play along get to stay in the room, where the watchdog function of the press is gradually eroded through 1,000 small acts of retaliation and intimidation. And the pharmaceutical executives standing behind Trump understand this dynamic perfectly, because they operate in industries where managing public perception is just as important as developing products, where the ability to control narrative and limit scrutiny determines stock prices and regulatory outcomes, and ultimately profits. Let's talk about class war, because that's what this is. The failure of our legal system to punish such conduct, from which the nation is still recovering, reinforces the belief that our justice system is two-tiered, and the message for the very wealthy and powerful is that they will always be insulated from accountability, even as hundreds of thousands of the rank and file suffer the full force of the law for a small fraction of the illegal conduct that multinational companies write off as the cost of doing business. This is the reality that Trump's populist rhetoric obscures. This is the truth that his performance of concern for ordinary Americans is designed to hide, because while he stands there talking about insurance company greed and drug prices, he is himself a member of that protected class, has been his entire life, has used wealth and lawyers and connections to avoid consequences for everything from tax fraud to sexual assault accusations to incitement of insurrection. The two-tiered justice system is real, but Trump embodies its upper tier. He is its beneficiary, not its victim, and his refusal to submit to questioning while Epstein documents are about to be released is a perfect encapsulation of how elite impunity functions in practice. What survivors of Epstein's abuse need and deserve is not selective disclosure aimed at political enemies, not investigations designed to provide cover for withholding evidence, not performances of concern from people who are themselves implicated in the systems of power that enabled the abuse. What they need is comprehensive transparency, full release of all relevant documents with only the minimal redactions necessary to protect victim identities, accountability for everyone who participated in or enabled or covered up the trafficking network, regardless of their political affiliation or social status. And what the American people need is a press that can ask questions without being insulted or excluded, that can hold power accountable without fear of retaliation, that can pierce through spectacle to demand answers about substance. When Trump refuses to take questions, he is refusing to participate in the democratic process. He is asserting instead an authoritarian model, where leaders speak and subjects listen, where announcements replace dialogues, where control of information becomes the primary mechanism of governance. The pharmaceutical industry has spent decades buying influence through campaign contributions and lobbying and funding think tanks and capturing regulatory agencies, and the idea that meaningful reform of drug pricing can happen through voluntary commitments negotiated in private between executive and the president without congressional oversight or independent enforcement mechanisms is absurd on its face. But absurdity is precisely the point in spectacle politics. The goal is not to solve problems but to appear to solve them, not to challenge power but to perform challenge while actually consolidating it, not to transform systems but to manage discontent while keeping those systems fundamentally intact. And the timing of this announcement at the precise moment when Epstein documents are supposed to be released cannot be understood as coincidental, because this administration has demonstrated again and again that it understands news cycles and narrative control and the strategic deployment of distraction, that it recognizes that in an attention economy, the key to avoiding accountability is not necessarily to suppress information, but simply to ensure that other stories dominate headlines and social media feeds. Asking the President of the United States questions in the Oval Office and aboard Air Force One is a privilege granted to journalists, not a legal right, according to a White House statement, and this framing reveals everything about how this administration conceptualizes its relationship to democratic accountability, because journalism is not a privilege granted by power, it is a constitutional function, essential to democracy itself. The press is not in the room as a favor from the president, but as a representative of the public, that has every right to know what its government is doing and why. The attempt to reframe questioning as privilege rather than right is an attempt to subordinate journalism to executive authority, to transform the Fourth Estate from a check on power into a dependent grateful for whatever access it receives. This is authoritarian logic dressed up in procedural language, and it should alarm everyone regardless of their partisan affiliation, because once you accept this principle, you have accepted that accountability is optional, that transparency is discretionary, that citizens have no inherent right to know what their government does in their name. So when you watch this clip, understand that what you're seeing is not just one moment of press avoidance, not just one defensive reaction to uncomfortable questions, but a comprehensive strategy of opacity and control, a systematic effort to construct an information environment where power operates without scrutiny, where elite networks protect themselves while claiming to expose elite corruption, where spectacle replaces substance and performance replaces policy, and the fundamental architecture of democratic accountability is gradually dismantled through 1,000 small acts of refusal and retaliation and intimidation. Trump standing there, flanked by pharmaceutical executives refusing to answer questions, while Epstein documents remain hidden behind redactions and classifications, and investigative privilege is not an aberration. It is the system working exactly as it was designed to work for those with power, working to protect them from consequences, working to insulate them from scrutiny, working to ensure that the two-tiered justice system remains firmly in place with them on top and the rest of us below. This is what oligarchy looks like in real time. This is how elite impunity perpetuates itself, and the fact that it happens while draped in populist rhetoric about fighting for ordinary Americans makes it more insidious, not less, because the capture is disguised as liberation. The consolidation of elite power is presented as its opposite, and millions of people who are being exploited by this system are persuaded to defend it, because the spectacle of opposition has replaced the substance of solidarity. We need to see through this performance to the reality it obscures. We need to connect the refusal to answer questions about drug pricing to the refusal to release Epstein documents, to the systematic intimidation of journalists, to the comprehensive strategy of elite protection that operates regardless of which party temporarily holds power. The Epstein files represent a moment of potential reckoning with how power actually operates in America, with how elite networks function to protect their members from accountability, and the desperate scramble to manage their release, to control the narrative around them, to use investigations as cover for continued opacity, reveals exactly how high the stakes are and how determined the powerful are to maintain the systems that serve their interests at everyone else's expense.